Welcome to the Veritas Forum, engaging university students and faculty in discussions about life's hardest questions and the relevance of Jesus Christ to all of life.
Laredo is known for many wonderful things and also some not so wonderful things. Among the wonderful things are the mariachis, and I'm not talking about the musicians. I'm talking about flour tortillas with eggs and chorizo and salsa. It's what you Californians call breakfast tacos. So we call them mariachis. Mariachis are among Laredo's most spectacular specialties. Laredo is also one of the hottest cities in the U.S., where temperatures are above 90 degrees Fahrenheit 6 months of the year. Does anyone here remember cassette tapes? When I was a kid, any cassette tapes left in the car during the day would melt. Literally, very hot. Laredo is also a very poor community, where almost half of the children live in poverty, and I was one of them. My mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 3rd grade education, and together they had a total of 12 children. I was second to the youngest, and before I turned 5, my parents separated, and my mother was left to raise her children on the minimum wage, no job security, no benefits, and no child support. My mother worked extremely hard to support our family, and to this day, I have never seen anyone work harder. She often worked night shifts, double shifts, multiple jobs, you name it. Understandably, she was often exhausted, stressed, and angry, and sometimes she took it out on us. But my escape from problems at home was school. The better I performed, the more attention I received from my teachers, and I loved it. In fact, I became rather obsessed with following all the rules because of the attention that I got from my teachers, and also because I had learned at church that I needed to live a life of obedience, following all the rules at all times. So I worked very hard and aimed for perfect attendance and perfect grades, not because I wanted to go to college, but rather because I actually knew that was out of the question, but rather because I wanted to please God. I thought that I could earn my way to heaven. In fact, I even imagined that God was somehow keeping a list and checking it twice. When I was a junior in high school, my guidance counselor, who previously had been my 6th grade science teacher, gave me an application for a summer school program at Harvard. I knew it was a very long shot, but I applied and got accepted. However, my thrill of admission quickly faded because there was no financial aid. With my mother's encouragement, I sent letters and visited local businesses asking for financial support. And in addition, one of my older sisters got a loan from her employer, and 3 of my older brothers gave me cash from their earnings. Literally cash. So you see, they ran a casa de cambio. That's a money exchange business. They ran this casa de cambio in Nuevo Laredo on the other side of the border. I remember walking across the border at age 16, carrying $1,500 of cash. Now, this was a lot of money over 20 years ago, especially for me. $1,500 was equivalent to about 2 months of earnings for my mother. I was praying that no one would notice the cash that I was carrying, as customs officials would assume that I had obtained the cash illegally. And I knew they wouldn't buy the Harvard story. So I prayed. And that day, my purse was not inspected as it had before, and I had the money that I needed to pay for summer school. So with a borrowed suitcase in hand, I arrived at Harvard the summer of 1991. Although it was clear to me that God had provided in spectacular ways, as I got my first taste of college, I had a very uneasy sense of being trapped in an endless pursuit of an unattainable goal. At summer school, I met lots of students who were much smarter and better prepared than I was, and I soon began to realize that no matter how hard I worked, I could never be like them. I remember in particular meeting a student named Steve, and as I got to know him, I learned that he had just received an almost perfect SAT score. And I was stunned. I had never seen anyone get such a score. And I asked him about this, and I learned that he had been preparing for the SAT since the 8th grade. The 8th grade. What a nerd, right? But he was similarly surprised that I had taken the SAT with no prior preparation. So he bought me a study guide, which I thought was very romantic. He also gave me a stack of college applications of campuses that he had researched and visited, as well as financial aid forms. But what really affected me was a conversation that I had with Steve about our spiritual beliefs. I had always thought that I needed to earn my way to God. But he asked, "Who are you to think you can be good enough for a perfect and holy God? Who do you think you are?" Good question. He straight out told me that I could never be good enough for God through my own actions. And this was the first time I had heard this. It completely turned everything I knew and worked for upside down. Yet the idea that I could not even begin to compare myself with a perfect, all-knowing, all-powerful God was incredibly liberating. I continued to work hard, but I felt like a heavy burden of pretentiousness had been lifted because I learned that God loved me, not because of anything I did or anything I had to offer, but because I am simply a daughter of God. That simple. Now that I am a mother, I have a slightly better understanding of what that type of unconditional love and acceptance looks like. Well, a year later, I was reunited with my Harvard summer school boyfriend, but this time at Stanford. It turns out that Steve had given me a stack of college applications because he was hoping that we might end up at the same school. He also confessed that he had arranged our chance encounter by figuring out my course schedule and pretending to be reading a book at a water fountain in front of my building when class ended. In short, he had been stalking me. His scheme worked, and we got married the summer after our sophomore year at the age of 19. Once again, God had provided for me in spectacular ways by putting the right people in my life at just the right time. But Stanford kicked my butt. I got straight C's my first quarter, and I had never worked so hard for my grades. I cried a lot and felt defeated. I even questioned whether Stanford had made a mistake in letting me in. Yet people came beside me and convinced me that I had the ability to do the work. But I had a lot of catching up to do. I needed to put in about twice the amount of time as my peers in order to study. It seemed to me that my peers were having a lot of fun in college with campus activities, movie nights, frisbee golf. To me, college was not fun. I, in the meantime, had to spend extra time in meetings with my calculus and chemistry TAs. I struggled to keep up with the reading load. But small victories led to larger ones, and eventually my grades improved. And by the time I was a junior, I was getting straight A's again. One of the greatest lessons I learned in college was that my accomplishments aren't really mine. Many people played a huge role in helping me, and I haven't even mentioned the institutional aid, the Pell Grants, the scholarships, the programs for first-generation college students, and so on. What is clear is that I did not do anything alone. I needed lots of help every step of the way, and this is when I started to think very carefully and seriously about what I could do to make things better for others, particularly those who grew up like me. So I began to study educational inequality. Very quickly, I learned whether we focus on school resources or student outcomes, the disparities between those who are socioeconomically advantaged and those who are not are very large, and they haven't changed very much, not nearly as much as we might think. All forms of segregation remain high, and study after study shows very clearly that systemic patterns exist where poor and racial minorities have inferior educational opportunities and lower achievement and attainment. If we look at the trends since the 1970s, we see that some progress has been made, but in general it has been slow and in some cases at a crawl. For example, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, it's also known as NAEP for short. This exam shows that the Hispanic white reading test score gap among 9-year-olds has narrowed since 1975, but remains large and significant. If we look at this gap for 13-year-olds, we see that the reading gap has not changed much in over 3 decades. Among 17-year-olds, the reading gap has narrowed somewhat since 1975, but again remains large and significant. And we see the same story for blacks. This is what the gaps look like for 9-year-olds. The gaps have narrowed since 1975, but remain large and significant. 13-year-olds, same pattern. 17-year-olds, same pattern. How large are these gaps? What do these numbers mean? To illustrate, in reading, Black and Hispanic 17-year-olds score about the same as white 13-year-olds. Let me say that again to make sure you understood what I said. That's not a typo. Black and Hispanic 17-year-olds score about the same as white 13-year-olds. Now, this is better than 1975 when white 13-year-olds scored better than Black and Hispanic 17-year-olds, but we clearly have a long way to go if we want to level the playing field. And we see the same story in math, where once again, Black and Hispanic 17-year-olds score about the same as white 13-year-olds, and this pattern hasn't changed since 1973. When I see these graphs, it breaks my heart. These aren't numbers, these aren't statistics, these are children. And these trends have very serious implications for their life trajectories. And frankly, these trends have very serious implications for all of us. As a Christian researcher, I look at this and see the product of a broken world. Not just broken people, but broken systems, institutions, and social structures. It's not just individuals discriminating, it's entire systems of discrimination resulting from generations of brokenness. Even if we as individuals do not discriminate anymore, we are part of a discriminatory system that works for some while trapping others. For example, property values. They decline when neighborhoods have high proportions of racial and ethnic minorities, and families with means flee from these neighborhoods as well as from schools with high proportions of racial and ethnic minorities. Many homebuyers and parents, maybe even subconsciously, use race as a code, as an indicator to determine whether a school or a neighborhood is good for their kids. And if there are too many black kids or too many Hispanic kids, it can't be good. So they put their kids somewhere else. I recently wrote an op-ed about this for the USA Today, describing the research about how parents choose schools. It's not based on schools' profiles. It's not based on academic testing. It's not based on disciplinary actions on the staff profiles. It's based on perceived class and racial composition. That is how people choose where to live and where to send their kids to school. A couple of years ago, I purchased a home in Houston, and I can assure you that this code is still very real. Realtors use it, neighbors use it, insurance agents use it, and it is still very wrong. Some of this is as a result of overt discrimination, but some of this stems from an understandable desire to protect our financial investments and to make sure that our children don't attend inferior schools. But why do property values decline? And why are so many schools inferior? And why are disadvantaged students systematically relegated to these schools? The fact is, we live and function in broken systems that cannot possibly live up to the ideals with which we designed them. From one perspective, it makes perfect sense to flee a neighborhood if your property value is circling the drain, or your school is failing your children. But from God's perspective, the system is broken, and Christians must be at the forefront of the fight to fix it. Before I moved to Houston, one of my students at the University of Wisconsin, who happened to be from Houston, recommended that I visit her old church. She warned me that it was a little weird, but promised me it was worth a try. She didn't warn me that this church would persuade my husband to get a tattoo, but that's another story. One of the first sermons that I heard at this church was about the dangers of focusing on rules and the tireless struggle to do the right things. I had been an obsessed rule follower, so this got my attention. Sure, there are things that God doesn't want us to do, but imagine what our world could be like if we focused more on the things that God does want us to do. So in this sermon, my pastor highlighted one commonly misunderstood word. That word was righteousness. Now, righteousness is a word that I had grown up with, and I thought that it was about obedience and morality. But the Bible defines it as restorative justice. Restorative justice. It's not self-righteousness. It's about God restoring my brokenness and making things right. Furthermore, it's about God restoring our brokenness so that we can be active agents for restoring justice in all of creation. The purpose of our restoration is so that we can play an active role in transforming the world for good, in bringing justice and peace, in fixing things like this graph. Now, God has always cared more about restorative justice than religious activities of self-righteous people. In fact, in the Bible, in the book of Amos, God says some very harsh words to people that focus on this self-righteousness that I just described. God says, I despise your religious festivals. I cannot stand your assemblies. Even though you bring me burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. Though you bring choice fellowship offerings, I will have no regard for them. Away with the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the music of your harps. But let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. This is what God cares about, not self-righteous activities. God cares about restorative justice. God wants to restore us and all of creation. This is God's world. These are God's children in the graphs that we saw earlier. So when I see problems like these, as a Christian, I cannot ignore them, or worse, contribute to them and think I'm okay because I went to church this week or I gave money to charity. If Christians don't care about what God cares about, God is not interested in our church activities, our money, or our praise songs. And justice for the poor is particularly near and dear to God's heart. The Bible describes how Jesus visited the synagogue where he grew up, the place where he learned to read, perhaps the first century Jewish equivalent to high school. The book of Luke says the following: He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened to him. Proclaiming good news to the poor and setting the oppressed free. This is what God really cares about. A few years ago, when I was at Wisconsin, I invited a sociology professor from Rice University to speak at UW. And when he told me that Rice was hiring, I was immediately drawn to the idea of possibly returning to Texas after nearly 18 years away. Besides the fact that I'm not a winter person, I had 2 young children who were growing up far from family, and I had several family members in Texas who were facing serious problems that needed more than help from a distance. However, I was reluctant to leave my position at one of the top sociology departments in the country. After praying about it, I felt that God was telling me to quit worrying about the rankings. So I applied and was ecstatic when I received a call from Rice with a job offer on a very cold January morning, which I took as a sign from God. But shortly before moving to Houston, I received a call from a foundation interested in funding an education research center, and they invited me to submit a grant proposal. Now, to be clear, I never, ever received phone calls from people inviting me to ask them for money. That had never happened before and probably never will again. Despite the lure of research dollars, I wondered whether God wanted me to do this. So I went on a personal retreat and dedicated a day to prayer and met with a spiritual director. For me, spending a whole day in prayer is highly unusual and very difficult to coordinate, but I felt that I needed God's guidance. At the end of the retreat, I felt at peace about moving forward with the grant proposal, which took my work in a whole new direction. Now, up to that point, I had grown quite frustrated that my research was not really having an impact on the world. I went to grad school to become an academic precisely because I wanted to make a difference. Unfortunately, I soon discovered that research universities aren't really conducive to that type of work. We're expected to produce rigorous research that will result in lots of publications with the most prestigious journals and publishers. Now, whether that research is then applied and used to improve lives is irrelevant. All evaluations, promotions, and tenure decisions are based on how much we publish, not our impact on the world. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that I think that this research process or the publication process is useless. I do think it serves a very important role. The blind review process in particular is very useful in forcing us to polish our work and produce better quality research. However, it shouldn't stop there. Publishing should be a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. And that's the problem with many research universities in the way things are today. At the same time, when speaking to education administrators and decision makers, many of them told me that although they're expected to make evidence-based decisions, which is a catchy phrase right now, they are so busy with their administrative work and putting out fires that they don't have time to keep up with the research literature. So on the one hand, we have education researchers producing high-quality work that is published in academic journals that are largely read only by other academics. On the other hand, we have education decision makers that could really use this research knowledge, but either don't have access to it, or don't have the time to read it, or frankly don't have the research training to understand it well. We live in separate worlds and rarely communicate directly with each other. Imagine what we could accomplish if we bridged this communication gap. So I decided that my proposed research center needed to be a partnership between education researchers and education administrators and decision makers so that they could inform our research agendas and so that we could inform their decision making. The aim of this research center is not just studying these problems, but actually using research to close the achievement gaps we just saw. I submitted my proposal and a few months later was granted $1.3 million to develop a partnership between Rice University and the Houston Independent School District. The concept of restorative justice compels me to search for ways to ensure that my research is useful and beneficial in a manner that is aligned with God's vision of renewal and transformation. Now, clearly there's a lot of work to be done, and my work is far from perfect. Just ask my reviewers. But it's worth it because despite my imperfect efforts and failures, I know that ultimately God will restore this world. If you do not consider yourself to be a Christian, or perhaps you're exploring Christianity, I wonder if, like me, before I was challenged by Steve, maybe you have a perception of Jesus that simply doesn't match up to the Jesus of the Bible. Maybe you're trying to please people, or even God, with your own efforts. Maybe you don't realize the deep and unconditional love that Jesus offers. If that's you, I would encourage you to read one of the accounts of Jesus' life for yourself. Maybe start with the book of Luke and see for yourself how Jesus cares for the poor, the marginalized, the lonely. If you are a Christian, my prayer is that you would grow more and more to care about the things that God cares about, and that you will play some small role in the process of restorative justice, whether that's through educational inequality or something else. There's plenty of work to be done. I'd like to end with a prayer that one of my students gave to me that I find particularly inspirational. May God bless you with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that you may live deep within your heart. May God bless you with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that you may work for justice, freedom, and peace. May God bless you with tears to shed for those who suffer pain, rejection, hunger, and war, so that you may reach out your hand. And may God bless you with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in the world so that you can do what others claim cannot be done. Thank you. I couldn't remember it. Paul, great question. Huge questions. I'll start with the second one and then sort of address the first one because I probably don't have time to even skim the surface. But for the second question about how do you do this? How do you integrate in these neighborhoods in a way that is really, truly beneficial? That is such a hard question. There are several studies going on right now trying to get at that question. There are some attempts. I know that when I was in grad school, there was a neighborhood in Boston that was attempting to be truly socioeconomically integrated. And unfortunately, what we have found, not just in the case of Boston, but in other locations, what we have found is that they don't last. They are able to integrate, and in terms of preventing that gentrification process that you described, they explicitly tried to provide low-income housing, but on a sliding scale, so it was high-quality housing for people with low incomes as well as people with higher incomes. And a great effort was made to do that, huge investment, but frankly, these types of neighborhoods generally don't last for more than, say, a decade or so. So on a large scale, it's not very long. So that is a challenge that we're still trying to work on. And in terms of the neighborhood integration, another approach has been to provide school choice so that families don't necessarily have to send their children to neighborhood zone schools. So there are pros and cons to that approach, but that has also presented some challenges. So, for example, in Houston, we have school choice. We do have zones, but technically speaking, a family can choose to send their child to any public school in the Houston area. But effectively, what happens is that the better schools have huge wait lists and the lesser schools have plenty of openings. So effectively, there isn't true school choice, even though technically speaking, that exists. So there are many, many challenges that remain. Now, to briefly answer your first question, I kind of forgotten, but I would like to try to forget for the moment, but because that's a tough one. What can we do in order to address these particular gaps that are huge? And I can't give you there is no silver bullet solution, obviously. These have been around for decades and decades. That's why I wanted to show you the long-term trends, not just the current patterns, the long-term trends. They have been around for decades. Clearly, we have already attempted many, many things, and some of which are working, but some are not. What I would like to say in terms of putting in the plug for this university school district partnership idea, I think that has potential, not because there's like one silver bullet solution out there, but that has a lot of potential in terms of making better informed decisions. And I will give you one brief example. Are we still recording? We're still recording? I will not give you that example. But if you, in all seriousness, if you stick around afterwards, I'd be happy to give you one example of how this has a lot of potential, but it's because it's current stuff that's going on right now, so I want to be careful about how publicly I speak about these things. Great questions.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and speaking. I'm Sarah, and I'm on staff at University, Christian Fellowship here on campus. And my question is, I know that systemic injustices are also in our upper education systems as well. And my question for you is, we talk about a lot with my students and I about engaging these injustices even on our own campus. But a lot of times we don't know exactly what they are or how to tackle it and how to be advocates for other people on our campus. How would you suggest us becoming informed, and not only informed, but what would be the best avenue of getting more involved on our campus and the things that are happening?
That's a great question. Your name was Sandy?
Sarah.
Sarah. Great question. So one of the things that it's kind of a dirty secret in education, in that we tend to focus a lot when one of the big outcomes of interest when we talk about educational inequality is the high school dropout rates. And there are huge problems to address there, not just overall that they're higher than we would like, but the disparities between groups, that vary, some patterns there too. Now, the issue with high school dropout rates, as bad as they are, the dirty little secret is that dropout rates are much, much higher in higher education, right? And I have some graphs that I could show you, stunning. Even whether you look at 4-year graduation rates, now switch from dropout rates to graduation rates, 4-year graduation rates, 6-year graduation rates, even 8-year graduation rates, very, very low, and a huge variation by type of institution and also by group of students. So there are definitely some big issues in higher education. So one way to get involved is to first of all, be informed about what is going on in higher education. And there are some great research studies going on right now that are trying to disentangle the many, many explanations behind those rates. But also, another great way to get involved more practically in a more hands-on way, there are many, many opportunities for those of us who have made it to a higher ed institution to then turn and mentor and work with high school students and younger students, many of whom do not have access. I just told you my story. I was a straight A student and I didn't know that I was supposed to prepare for the SAT. I didn't know what I was supposed to do in order to go to college. And I was a straight A student. Why didn't anyone tell me that? Right? And one of the issues that we're dealing with right now in Houston, there are so many schools that do not have guidance counselors or other professionals that are available. You know which schools have one? The more advantaged schools, the ones with students who they have access to this information from home. Now the students that don't have access to this information from home, they're the ones going to schools that don't have guidance counselors and other professionals providing them. It's totally backwards. So until we can fix that, I think that's a great way for college students, because you've been through the process, you're in college, you understand that process. Go and inform these students. They need that information.
Hello. Hi. My name is Melissa. I'm a liberal studies student here, and so I'm going into special education, so this is something that's really important. And I'm also with Destino. And they kind of took my questions already, but something that I kind of wanted to address is going on, your last question, pardon me, was how would you suggest going about the inequality that we have with our budget system right now in Cal State, especially with Long Beach and everything? How do you think that we I guess just me as a person, as a Christian, and as a student, how would you suggest with real solutions that we can maybe get people's attention, or to just to organize better, just so people can really see what's going on, like she said?
That's a tough question, Alyssa.
Yeah.
So the financial disparities work at a much higher level than the things that I've been talking about so far. But one thing I can say about the financial disparities is that, so this is a public school, publicly funded school, correct? So these types of decisions are made at the state level, state legislature. If there are ways that you can get informed and involved at that level, I don't know if there are folks that feel particularly drawn to those methods or help me some poli-sci majors, but I would highly recommend that you get involved at that level, because that's the level at which these decisions are made in terms of the funding of universities. And you are absolutely right that we're at a point in time where things are really, really challenging, and they could get a whole lot worse if certain types of decisions are made. So those of us who are in positions to get involved in this way, or that want to figure out a way to get involved at that legislative way, by all means do it, because we are at a point where things could get a lot worse in terms of the funding. And not just California, it's all over the country. I did not mention some of my other reasons for leaving the University of Wisconsin, but frankly, the financial situation at Wisconsin was wasn't the only reason by any means. Wisconsin was very good to me, but that was one of the reasons why I left.
I'm Joel. I don't quite know my question, but as I was sitting back there, I was just thinking about my own people, my Latino brothers and sisters in this country, and it just makes me sad just seeing this generation grow up with no desire for education, or no push from their parents, or value in their parents' minds for education. Not everyone, obviously, but I have a lot of cousins that just don't care for school, for example. And as I was sitting back there, I was like, well, I'm a guy. I like to think practically about fixing things, right? And so one idea I had, I said, well, why don't I go back to my high school where I graduated from, and maybe talk to the career counselor and ask her, could I come and speak to your at-risk youth? You know, the at-risk, the students who are failing, the students who don't care about school. So that was one idea I had. I'm like, but are there any resources for doing things like that for us? Instead of me Wikipedia and everything and pulling out some statistics that I don't even know are true. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you have to be careful with Wikipedia.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a good source, but be careful. No, in terms of Joao or Joel?
Joel.
Joel with an L. Joel, okay. I was making it like Portuguese. Joao. So okay, that was me, right? Sorry. One of the things that I wanted to catch a phrase that you used. You talked about some people not really being interested in education and not aspiring. There are a couple of things I want to mention. So because it's more complicated than that, as you might already know. There are many really poor parents, or parents who do not have a high level of education, who absolutely care about their children's education. They might not know what to do, how to guide their children in terms of getting an education, but in terms of their desire for their children and their support, they can provide support to some extent, but it is limited, obviously, if they don't really have the resources or the information to guide their children. But I just wanted to be careful about that, because there are some parents that out there that really do care about their children's education, but some outsiders might see that and interpret it as they don't really care about their kids' education. Well, not necessarily. They might just not have the resources or the information to do it in the way that we would, those of us who have been through the system, that we would see as being more useful. But the other comment that I wanted to make about the aspirations. So in the education literature, we use two different concepts. We distinguish between aspirations and expectations. And the reason why we distinguish between those is because, interestingly enough, in many surveys, national surveys, poor and minority students have very high aspirations, which refer to what they would like to accomplish in terms of their education, yet they tend to have much lower expectations. That refers to what they realistically think will happen. Those are two different things. You ask a kid, poor kid, what would you like to do? How far in school would you like to go? Their aspirations tend to be pretty high, similar to other kids. But their expectations, how far in school do you expect to go realistically? Right? So the reason why I make that distinction is because they might still have that desire, but they look around them and they see, well, hardly anybody's going to college in my neighborhood, or nobody in my family has gone to college, or, it's not realistic for them. And so, of course, they're going to have lower expectations. So we need to figure out a way to change that, to make these things seem a little bit more real. So someone like you, you're in a perfect position because you're here, you're in college. So now they know, hey, you look like me, you did it. So if you could do it, maybe I could do it too. These things matter a lot. These models matter a lot, especially for young, vulnerable kids. Thank you for your comments and questions.
I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on the issue of school choice, because just my personal experience has been whenever I utter that phrase to a professor or a school administrator, there's absolutely no conversation about it. And I know, as you said, it's not the answer to a lot of problems, but to what extent do you think maybe it could be a step in the right direction for some areas, or should that be like a statewide or a national goal?
It's a great, what's your name? You can say your name.
Brittany.
Brittany, okay. The reason why school choice, and there are many reasons why school choice is so controversial, but I would say there are two issues that I would like to address. The first one is that there is a danger in that school choice is very likely to be carried out in a way that still advantages some kids over others. So if that happens, like what I just mentioned is happening in Houston right now. They technically have school choice, but if you look at the distribution by economic status and by race, the schools are very, very segregated. So we have school choice for what? The schools are still very, very segregated. So even though I think that idea has very good intentions, the way it's carried out is such that it's just reproducing the status quo in many cases. But I know what they're trying to accomplish, right? They're trying to give disadvantaged students an opportunity to attend higher quality schools. So I'm all for that as a concept, but the fact of the matter is that when it's actually carried out in practice, the end result is often not all that different from the original state of things. The second issue that I want to mention really quickly is that in some ways, school choice is a band-aid solution. If you really think about it, right? The reason why we're trying to give students a choice about which school to go to is because of the fact that schools are highly segregated and there are huge qualitative differences from school to school. And so we're trying to, move students around. Well, in some ways it's a band-aid solution in the sense that it's not fixing the schools, right? We're trying to redistribute students, but there's still students that are going to be left behind in the poor performing schools. And what's happening to them. And the types of students that tend to be left behind in those schools tend to be the most disadvantaged, like the kinds whose parents aren't informed enough to do their research and do the school choice thing. I have a PhD from Harvard, and I found the whole school choice process to be pretty challenging to understand in Houston. And I am not exaggerating. I found it very challenging to understand. I have a PhD from Harvard. And how do we expect poor, disadvantaged parents to get informed and make the right decisions and know how the lottery system works and know where to, wow. So I feel like, oh, it's good intentions, it's got potential, but usually it's not carried out in a way that is producing significantly different results, and it's ultimately kind of a band-aid solution. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Clarence. First thing I want to say is thanks for coming to speak.
My pleasure.
First, I think it was great how you addressed how we can make a difference as individuals. So I guess my question now would be, as Christians, as a church, and as a body of Christ, what are some specific things that we can focus on in our daily prayer lives that we can pray about to be more effective in our prayers?
Thank you. So, Clarence, that's right. So, besides the individual or small group ideas that we've discussed so far, as a group of people, and in particular as Christians, quite honestly, I'm very frustrated with what Christians have done up to this point. and myself included. The reason why I'm quite frustrated is because, in terms of education, Christians' typical response has been to retreat. It's been to retreat. To either, and I'm just saying in general, not all Christians do this, but it's a common response to pull their kids out of public schools, send them to private Christian schools, or homeschool their kids, and it's to retreat, and I can totally understand that. They're trying to do what's best for their kids. I can understand it. But then what? All the other kids are screwed. And in some ways, screwed even worse. Because now these families with means and resources, and more importantly, human capital, are pulling away. And I think that that's wrong. At least on some level. I mean, we've got to think very carefully about what we're doing. It's a really tough one. I'm a mother, so I'm not saying this. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm not just being all judgmental. I completely understand these decisions, especially for some people that live in areas that are particularly problematic, right? But I feel like Christians should be able to do more than that. And in terms of, so to get at the heart of your question about what Christians could or should do, it's going back to what I mentioned during my talk, and that is that our starting point needs to be that we need to have a heart that is aligned with God's heart. We need to care about the things that God cares about, and God makes it abundantly clear in the Bible what God cares about, right? And if we truly care about those things, then we're going to be doing things. It might look very different for you than for me, but we're going to be doing something in order to really care. So that's why the talk was titled that, because the starting point is about really caring. And then, so for some people, it may be, figuring out a way to integrate their kids. For other people, it might be something different. But the fact is, we need to be doing something about this, because this is a serious, serious problem. And not just it's not just an educational problem, it's at a spiritual level too. As I said, this is a symbol of our brokenness. It's a great question. I don't think I've adequately answered your question, honestly, but it's a great question.
I think we got another question here. While he's coming up, just to follow on a really good point, I'm wondering, so let's say, I know we have segregation in churches sometimes.
Well,
and as you were talking, I'm thinking, my kids go to Christian school also. So
I figured that. I wanted to be careful about saying this.
Let's say kids are going to public schools, or they're going to public universities like Cal State Long Beach. What can we do to socialize our youth and get them ready? Because I'm thinking about Joel. He's going back to his schools and talking to them. What are the kinds of things that you think young people need to hear as they're going through this process? Because you gave a really great testimony about your matriculation through school, but what are some things that I think from a Christian perspective, but also from a concerned, caring person as well, what do you think young people need to hear?
Wow. Can I make a comment? You covered several things. Can I make a comment on the church segregation thing? I just wondered, I thought that you were going somewhere else. With the church segregation, I wonder, why did you mention church segregation?
Well, I just think about the different neighborhoods. I go to a fairly diverse church, and I'll just give a little explanation.
That's unusual.
Yeah. So we have a Black and Japanese pastor. The Japanese pastor
That's why it works.
mentoring.
No, you have to have leadership that's diverse.
Yeah. Our board is very diverse and mixed. It's over here nearby in Orange County. And it kind of came together because the mainly white church, the membership had gone down, and the Black church membership had grown. And we also have a Japanese congregation, Filipino congregation, in specific languages, but we kind of came together to really work with our youth.
Have any of you read or heard of a book called Divided by Faith. Ugh. Okay, I highly recommend it. It's a must-read. It addresses this issue head on. And it's written by a colleague and very dear friend of mine named Michael Emerson. When I told you the story about how when I was at Wisconsin, I invited a Rice professor to come speak, and that was Michael Emerson. And he's the reason why I ended up moving to Rice. Yeah, so he studies segregation. He's a sociologist in my department at Rice. Studies segregation, in particular focuses on church segregation. I have a lot to say about why that is why that is so problematic on many levels, social levels and spiritual levels. And that's just not what heaven's going to look like. So that's just, so there are many explanations. But anyway, I highly recommend that book. It's about 10 years old, but it's called Divided by Faith. But you asked another question.
About youth, and maybe how we talk to our youth about these segregated areas that we live in.
Right. I want to bring those two questions together. Since you brought up church segregation, your church is very unusual. If you look at the statistics, most churches do not look like that. And I think that one way, in terms of Christians who go to churches, like we might talk one way, and then on some days we're segregated again. A great thing to do for our youth is to have them and be involved. This is hard to pull off in some locations, but have them be involved in a truly integrated church, so that exposure also further helps them to have a heart for all God's people. Truly having a heart for all God's people. Because if we see these graphs and think, oh, too bad, or throw our hands up in there and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's sad, but there's nothing. That's the wrong response, right? But the way that you might really help our youth see why this is so important, I mean, they need that exposure, and not just, and I'm not just obviously exposing into these statistics, but that personal exposure, and I think in a church context would be fantastic. So I feel like I just brought those two together. I don't think that that's
I figured you could.
Let's see.
Hi, my name is Pam,
Pam.
and I'm a Christian, and I work in the Public Unified School District.
And she goes to that church.
Yes, I do.
LA?
Orange County.
Yes,
Orange
we're
County.
the
Because I
multicultural
just,
church.
on the airplane on the way over here, I saw the news about LA just started a partnership with UCLA, very similar to what we're doing in Houston, and they just passed a data sharing agreement with the school district, which I think is fantastic. But I digress. Go on.
Okay, my job, I'm a nutrition educator, so I have an audience of 10,000.
Wow.
I work with preschoolers all the way to high schools, and in fact, I have a lot of interns that come from Cal State Long Beach to intern with me. So my question to you is, how do I partner with you to help you achieve your goal of reaching the masses? And I would say about 8% of our target population is the lower socioeconomic group.
I don't know. I don't know. How you personally partner with me personally, we should talk more, but I don't know if did I misunderstand?
I don't know if it's, I mean, if I can, I'm more than happy to. But we're saying go out and do. I have the audience.
Yes.
What do I go out and do?
Right. So rather than, so my goal in some of the things that I said in my talk tonight, it wasn't necessarily to prescribe specifics, but rather to really encourage and challenge you to ask that question. And so I think that's great that you're asking that question, but I don't feel like I can answer it. But I would encourage you to give it some serious thought and have God really guide you in terms of what you specifically should be doing. And actually, I would encourage you to do something that I briefly mentioned during my talk. I mentioned that I went on a personal retreat. I very rarely do that because it's very hard to pull off. But if you're seriously considering something like, God, what do you want me to do? Which direction should I take this? I highly encourage you to take some time to just, dedicate an extended amount of time to really praying. And you'd be amazed at some of the things that result from something like that. I think I would encourage each and every one of you to do this and ask God to guide you. What should I do with the children in my neighborhood, or what should I do with, many of you are making career decisions and life decisions, and you'd be amazed at, I don't know what God will tell you, but I imagine some really great things, especially given the position that you hold right now. I think it's got a lot of potential.
Yeah, because I have a lot of interaction one-on-one, and I have a little slogan, because nutrition is just as tough as education.
Well, they're related. They're very directly
Very
related,
much so.
absolutely.
And I have a little slogan that goes, each one reach one and teach one. Okay? Each person reaches a person and teaches a person.
Each one,
reaches one.
Got it.
Because I work with parents too. And I would imagine that would be the same approach that as an individual I could take in reaching out to high school students to keep them from dropping out and to help them to continue on, and don't be discouraged with a system that doesn't seem to work from their view.
Right.
Thank you.
I will also add Long Beach Unified and Long Beach City College and our university. They just reestablished their agreement to do some sharing with our College of Education and other faculty members.
Great.
Just wanted to add another piece there. Are there any other questions? If not, I think we can move into our next portion. But before we do that, all right, I wanted to thank Dr. López Turley for her excellent job and making the questions here.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.